The sun hung low over the rugged horizon, painting the Montana sky with strokes of crimson and gold as Cassandra Turner stood before the fresh mound of dirt that now held her husband of 5 years. The wind carried dust that stuck to her tear-stained cheeks, but she remained motionless, her black mourning dress billowing around her slender frame like a shadow stretching into the approaching night. "You don't have to stay and watch him go," a deep voice said from behind her. Cassandra didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the cowboy who had spoken. Her eyes remained fixed on the simple wooden cross bearing her husband's name, James Turner, 1851–1877. The ground had swallowed him whole, just as the consumption had done over these past months. "Mrs. Turner," the cowboy tried again, his spurs jingling softly as he stepped closer. "The night air gets mighty cold once the sun's gone. You can come back tomorrow." Finally, she turned, her green eyes meeting his. Xavier Keller stood tall, his weathered Stetson held respectfully against his chest. The evening light caught in his sandy hair and illuminated the concern etched on his sun-browned face. "I'm not ready," Cassandra whispered, her voice brittle like autumn leaves. "When I leave this place, it makes it real. It means I have to go back to our cabin. Alone." Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. He had known James, had worked alongside him at the Turner homestead outside San Pedro. The town, nestled in a valley in western Montana territory, had watched James and Cassandra arrive 3 years prior with hopes and dreams that now lay buried in the hard Montana soil. "I'll wait with you then," Xavier said simply, replacing his hat and standing a respectful distance away. As the sun sank below the mountains and twilight deepened around them, Cassandra felt the weight of finality settling over her. At 23, she was a widow in a harsh land, over 1,000 miles from her family back east in Pennsylvania. The small gathering of townspeople who had attended the burial had long since departed, returning to the warmth and light of San Pedro. "What will you do now?" Xavier finally asked as the first stars appeared overhead. "I don't know," she admitted, her words carried away by the wind. "The ranch. I can't manage it alone." "You could sell it," Xavier suggested quietly. "Go back east to your family." Cassandra's fingers traced the simple gold band on her left hand. "This is my home now. James and I built it together. I can't just—" Her voice broke, and she covered her mouth with her gloved hand. Xavier moved closer, offering a clean handkerchief which she accepted with trembling fingers. At 32, he had seen his share of hardships on the frontier. 10 years as a ranch hand, a trail driver, and occasionally a bounty hunter had hardened him to many things, but the sight of this young widow's grief stirred something protective within him. "The offer still stands," he said, "to help with the ranch until you decide what to do." "Why would you do that?" she asked, genuine confusion in her voice. "You barely know me." "I knew James. He was a good man. And no one should face the frontier alone, Mrs. Turner." As night descended completely, Cassandra finally allowed herself to be led away from the grave. Xavier walked her to the small wagon he had brought, helping her onto the seat before climbing up beside her. The journey back to the Turner homestead was silent except for the creak of wheels and the occasional snort from the horses. The cabin came into view, a dark silhouette against the starlit sky. No welcoming lamplight shone from its windows, no smoke curled from its chimney. It looked abandoned, forgotten, much like Cassandra felt. Xavier jumped down from the wagon and circled around to help her, but Cassandra had already begun her descent. Her foot caught on her dress, sending her tumbling forward. Strong hands caught her before she hit the ground, steadying her against a solid chest. "Easy now," Xavier murmured, releasing her once she found her footing. "Thank you," she said, stepping back and smoothing her dress with shaking hands. "For everything." "I'll be by tomorrow morning to help with the chores," he said, tipping his hat. "Try to get some rest, Mrs. Turner." As Cassandra watched him drive away, the weight of her solitude pressed down upon her like a physical thing. She entered the cold, dark cabin, striking a match to light the lamp. The familiar surroundings now seemed foreign without James's presence. His hat still hung by the door, his boots neatly placed beside it as if waiting for him to return. Sleep didn't come easily that night, nor the next, nor the one after. Each dawn brought Xavier Keller to her door, true to his word. He mended fences, tended livestock, and chopped enough firewood to last weeks. He rarely spoke beyond what was necessary, respecting her grief, never intruding on her moments of sadness. A month after the burial, Cassandra stepped onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee as Xavier split logs in the yard. Her black dress had been replaced by a simple brown skirt and white blouse, though she still wore her wedding band. "You should take a break," she called, holding up one of the cups. Xavier embedded the axe in the chopping block and wiped his brow with his sleeve before approaching. He accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, leaning against the porch railing. "The north pasture fence is finished," he reported. "Should keep the wolves out now." "Mr. Keller," Cassandra began, hesitating before continuing, "I can't keep accepting your help without payment. You have your own life, your own work." Xavier sipped his coffee, his blue eyes studying her over the rim of the cup. "Mr. Phillips at the Mercantile mentioned you might be selling some of your cattle. Said you'd asked about prices." Cassandra nodded, her shoulders tense. "I need the money. Winter's coming, and I can't manage the whole herd myself." "You could hire help," Xavier suggested. "With what money?" she asked with a humorless laugh. "James spent everything we had on medicine, on doctors who couldn't save him." Xavier was quiet for a moment, contemplating. "I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Turner." "Please," she said, "call me Cassandra. After all this time, I think formalities are unnecessary." "Cassandra," he amended with a slight nod. "I've been thinking about settling down, buying some land of my own. What if we entered into a business arrangement? I could work your land, manage the cattle. We split the profits. You keep your home, and I get a stake in something." Cassandra stared at him, surprise evident on her face. "You want to be my partner?" "Business partner," he clarified quickly. "I'd build my own cabin on the far side of the property. You'd have your privacy, your independence, but also help and protection." She looked out over the land that stretched before them, the land she and James had dreamed would provide their future, their children's future. Now it represented burden and obligation more than promise. "I'll think about it," she finally said, though in truth, she knew she had few options. The autumn days grew shorter, the nights colder. Xavier continued to help, never pushing for an answer to his proposition. Cassandra watched him work, noting his methodical approach to everything, the calm way he handled even the most difficult tasks. He was nothing like James, who had been full of enthusiastic dreams and impulsive decisions. Xavier was steady, practical, his emotions carefully contained beneath his reserved exterior. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Cassandra invited Xavier to stay for dinner, something she had started doing occasionally as a small payment for his help. The cabin was warm from the hearth, the simple meal of venison stew and fresh bread filling the air with comforting aromas. "I've decided to accept your proposition," Cassandra announced as she ladled stew into his bowl. "A business partnership makes sense. This land needs more than one person to work it properly." Xavier's eyes showed surprise, then satisfaction. "You won't regret it. I'll draw up papers, make everything official and proper." "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for helping me find a way to keep my home." That night, after Xavier had departed to return to his lodgings in town, Cassandra sat before the fire, her husband's wedding ring pressed against her lips. "I hope you understand, James," she whispered. "I'm trying to save what we built." The winter of 1877-1878 proved harsh, with blizzards that isolated the ranch for days at a time. Xavier had managed to construct a small cabin for himself before the worst weather hit, though it was little more than a shelter with a bed and stove. On the most brutal nights, Cassandra insisted he stay in the main house, offering him James's old chair by the fire while she retired to the bedroom. Those evenings, they would sit in companionable silence, sometimes sharing stories, Xavier of his travels across the territories, Cassandra of her life back east before coming west with James. She learned that Xavier had left home at 17, had fought briefly in the closing days of the Civil War despite being barely old enough to enlist, and had spent the subsequent years drifting through the expanding frontier. Never found a reason to stay in one place too long, he admitted one night as wind howled outside the cabin walls. Always figured the next town might hold something better. And now? Cassandra asked, looking up from her mending. Xavier stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. Now I'm tired of drifting. A man reaches a point where he wants something of his own. Spring arrived late but vigorously, transforming the landscape from white to vibrant green almost overnight. The cattle that had survived the winter were thin but healthy enough, and the partnership between Cassandra and Xavier began to take practical shape. They expanded the vegetable garden, repaired winter damage to the buildings, and prepared for the spring calving. It was during this time that Cassandra began to notice changes in herself. The paralyzing grief that had consumed her began to ease, making room for something else, not happiness, exactly, but a cautious contentment in the daily rhythms of ranch life. She found herself looking forward to the evenings when Xavier would join her for supper, their conversations becoming less about practicalities and more about ideas, memories, and occasionally even hopes. One particularly beautiful May evening, Cassandra walked to the small fenced plot where James was buried on a rise overlooking the ranch. She brought wildflowers, arranging them carefully at the base of the wooden cross that Xavier had carved with surprising skill to replace the cruder marker. "The ranch is doing well," she told her husband's grave, settling on the new bench Xavier had built nearby. "The arrangement with Mr. Keller is working better than I expected. You'd approve, I think. He's honest, hardworking." A sound behind her made her turn. Xavier stood at a distance, hat in hand, clearly uncertain if he was intruding. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "It's all right," she assured him, patting the space beside her on the bench. "I was just updating James on things." Xavier hesitated before joining her, keeping a respectful distance between them. "I've never understood if people really hear us after they're gone," he admitted. "But I like to think they do." "Have you lost someone close?" she asked, realizing how little she knew of his personal losses despite the months they had spent working side by side. "My younger brother," Xavier said, his voice softening. "Typhoid took him when he was just 19. That was 12 years ago now." Cassandra reached over and briefly touched his hand, a gesture of sympathy that lasted only a moment but seemed to bridge something between them. "I'm sorry." They sat in silence, watching as the setting sun bathed the ranch in golden light. A year ago, Cassandra reflected, she couldn't have imagined sitting peacefully beside another man at her husband's grave. Yet here she was, and somehow it felt right, as though James himself might have orchestrated this arrangement to ensure she wasn't left alone. "Town's having a social Saturday next," Xavier mentioned as they walked back to the main house. "Dance, pie auction, that sort of thing. Thought you might want to go. Be good for you to see people beyond just me and the occasional supply run." Cassandra considered the invitation. She hadn't attended a social function since before James fell ill. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of thing." "Been almost a year," Xavier said gently. "No one would think poorly of you for enjoying an evening of music and conversation." She looked down at her wedding ring, twisting it absently. "Perhaps you're right. A change might be nice." Saturday arrived clear and warm. Cassandra spent more time than usual preparing, washing her hair and pressing her best dress, a navy blue with delicate white piping that she hadn't worn since coming west. It wasn't exactly festive, but it wasn't morning attire either. She pinned her dark hair up, allowing a few curls to frame her face, and even added a touch of her precious rose water to her wrists. When she emerged from the house, Xavier was waiting with the wagon, dressed in clean clothing with his hair neatly combed. He stared at her a moment longer than was strictly proper before offering his hand to help her up. "You look nice," he said simply, though something in his eyes suggested he might have chosen more effusive words if he'd allowed himself. "Thank you," she replied, feeling a flush that had nothing to do with the warm evening air. "So do you." San Pedro had grown since Cassandra had last attended a town event. New buildings lined the main street, and the town square where the social was being held bustled with activity. Lanterns hung from trees, casting a warm glow over tables laden with food and a cleared area for dancing. A small band played lively tunes while children darted between adults and dogs lounged hopefully near the food tables. Several people greeted Cassandra warmly, expressing pleasure at seeing her in town again. If there were whispers about her arriving with Xavier Keller, she chose to ignore them. They were business partners, nothing more, regardless of what town gossips might imagine. Cassandra Turner, as I live and breathe. A plump woman with kind eyes enveloped her in a lavender-scented embrace. "We've missed you in our sewing circle." "Hello, Mrs. Porter." Cassandra returned the hug with genuine affection. "It's good to see you." "And you've brought Mr. Keller," Mrs. Porter observed, her eyes twinkling as she glanced between them. "How lovely." "We're business partners now," Cassandra explained quickly. "Mr. Keller has been instrumental in keeping the ranch running." "Is that what they're calling it these days?" Mrs. Porter said with a knowing smile. "Well, partner or not, you couldn't find a more respected man in these parts. Now, come have some punch and tell me everything." As Mrs. Porter led Cassandra away, she glanced back at Xavier, who gave her an encouraging nod before being drawn into conversation with several ranch hands he knew. The evening progressed pleasantly. Cassandra found herself enjoying the company of women she had neglected during James's illness and her subsequent mourning. The music, the laughter, the sense of community all reminded her of the parts of life she had been missing. When the pie auction began, she watched with amusement as bachelors bid enthusiastically for the chance to share dessert with the young women who had baked them. She hadn't contributed a pie, having been out of social circulation for so long, but she enjoyed the spectacle nonetheless. "Next up," announced Mr. Wilson, the auctioneer, "a peach pie from Miss Ellie Simmons." A pretty blonde stepped forward, holding her creation with obvious pride. The bidding started energetically, with several young men trying to outdo each other. $5, called a voice, silencing the others. Cassandra turned to see Xavier, holding up his hand. The crowd murmured $5 was an extravagant sum for a pie, even in a charity auction. Miss Simmons beamed, clearly flattered by such a high bid for her baking. "Sold to Mr. Keller," Mr. Wilson declared with a bang of his gavel. Cassandra felt an unexpected twist in her stomach as Xavier made his way to the front, paid his money, and accepted the pie with a courteous nod to Miss Simmons. The young woman's cheeks flushed pink as she smiled up at him. "Looks like Mr. Keller might be thinking of more than business partnerships," Mrs. Porter commented beside her. "Ellie Simmons has been hoping to catch his eye for months." "I see," Cassandra said, her voice carefully neutral despite the sudden hollow feeling in her chest. "Well, she's certainly pretty." She watched as Xavier and Miss Simmons settled at a table together, the pie between them. Xavier said something that made the young woman laugh, her hand touching his arm briefly. Cassandra turned away, making an excuse to Mrs. Porter about needing fresh air. She found a quiet spot away from the main gathering, berating herself for her reaction. Xavier was free to court whomever he wished. Their arrangement was purely business. He had made that abundantly clear, and she had no right to feel this. Disappointment. "Everything all right?" Xavier's voice startled her from her thoughts. Cassandra composed herself before turning. "Yes, Just needed a moment away from the noise. Are you enjoying Miss Simmons's pie? I brought you a piece, he said, holding out a plate. Best peaches this side of Georgia, according to the lady herself. Cassandra accepted the offering with confusion. But I thought. Thought what? That you and Miss Simmons would be sharing it. That's the tradition after all. Xavier shrugged. I bid on it because I know you like peaches. Mentioned once that they reminded you of home. Something warm spread through Cassandra's chest at the realization that he had remembered such a small detail from one of their fireside conversations months ago. That's very thoughtful, she said softly, taking a bite of the pie. It is good. Dance is starting. Xavier nodded toward the square where couples were forming for a Virginia reel. Would you like to join in? Or is that too much for one evening? Cassandra hesitated. Dancing seemed like crossing a boundary somehow, moving from practical partnership into something more personal. We don't have to, Xavier added quickly, seeing her uncertainty. Just thought you might enjoy it. No, I would like to, she decided, setting aside her plate. It's been a long time since I danced. Xavier offered his arm, leading her to where the dancers were lining up. The fiddle struck up a lively tune, and soon Cassandra found herself caught up in the pattern of the dance, stepping forward, back, turning around her partner, linking arms, and spinning down the line. Xavier was surprisingly light on his feet for a man who spent most of his time on horseback, and his hand was steady and warm when it clasped hers. As they moved through the figures of the dance, Cassandra caught herself smiling, genuinely smiling for the first time, in what felt like forever. When the music ended, her cheeks were flushed and her heart beating faster from exertion and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. Thank you, she said, slightly breathless. That was wonderful. Xavier's eyes held hers, something unspoken passing between them. It was my pleasure. The moment was broken by the band starting another tune and other dancers crowding around them. They participated in 2 more dances before Cassandra admitted she was growing tired, unaccustomed to such activity after her long period of seclusion. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the night air cool after the warmth of dancing. Cassandra found herself stealing glances at Xavier's profile in the moonlight, seeing him differently than she had before. Not just as a ranch hand, not just as a business partner, but as a man, one who noticed what kind of pie she liked, who danced with surprising grace, who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness since the day he stood with her at her husband's grave. I had a nice time, she said as he helped her down from the wagon at her doorstep. Thank you for suggesting it. Glad to hear it, he replied. You deserve some happiness, Cassandra. The use of her given name, which had become comfortable between them in private, now seemed to carry a different weight in the stillness of the night. His hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary before he released it, stepping back. Good night, he said, tipping his hat before turning toward his own cabin. Xavier, she called after him, the first time she had used his given name without the formality of Mr. Keller preceding it. He turned, surprise evident on his face. Thank you. Not just for tonight, but for everything these past months. I don't know what I would have done without you. A smile, rare and genuine, transformed his features. You're stronger than you think, Cassandra Turner. But I'm glad I could help. That night, Cassandra slept more peacefully than she had in months, her dreams filled with music and movement, and the feeling of a steady hand guiding her through the steps of a dance. The summer of 1878 brought its own challenges and rewards. A dispute with a neighboring rancher over water rights required Xavier to display a firmness Cassandra hadn't seen before. Standing his ground with a hand resting casually near his holstered revolver, he negotiated a compromise that protected their interests without bloodshed. Where did you learn to handle men like that? She asked afterward as they rode back to the ranch, impressed by his diplomatic yet authoritative approach. Had a few jobs as a deputy marshal, Xavier admitted. Learned quick that most men back down if you show them you won't, but nobody wins in a gunfight. Cassandra studied him with new eyes. "You continue to surprise me, Mr. Keller." A half-smile quirked his lips at her return to formality. "Likewise, Mrs. Turner." The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Cassandra's knowledge of accounts and business, learned from her merchant father back east, complemented Xavier's practical skills with land and livestock. By midsummer, they had increased their herd and even hired 2 young hands to help with the expanded operation. It was during the hottest days of August that disaster struck. Lightning ignited a fire in the drought-dried grass beyond their property. The wind drove it toward the ranch with frightening speed, threatening everything they had worked to build. "Get the men and wet down the house and barn," Xavier shouted as they spotted the approaching flames. "I'll try to cut a firebreak with the plow." Cassandra sprang into action, organizing the hands to form a bucket brigade from the well to the buildings. She worked alongside them, her skirts hiked up and tied at her waist, hair falling from its pins as she passed buckets and soaked blankets to drape over the roof. From her position, she could see Xavier in the distance, frantically guiding the horse and plow to cut a wide swath of bare earth between the approaching fire and their buildings. The wind shifted suddenly, driving the flames directly toward him. "Xavier," she screamed, dropping her bucket and running toward him without thinking. The fire roared closer, the heat intense even at a distance. Xavier abandoned the plow, slapping the horse to send it running away from danger, but his own path was rapidly being cut off by advancing flames. Cassandra reached the edge of the plowed area, waving frantically. "This way. Hurry." Xavier sprinted toward her, his coat discarded, shirt darkened with sweat and soot. As he neared, a burning branch fell directly in his path. He leaped over it but landed awkwardly, his leg buckling beneath him. Without hesitation, Cassandra ran into the danger zone, reaching his side and pulling his arm over her shoulders. "Lean on me," she urged, supporting his weight as they staggered toward safety. They collapsed together on the far side of the firebreak just as the flames reached it, hungrily consuming everything in their path, but unable to jump the gap of bare earth. For several heart-stopping minutes, they lay there catching their breath, watching as the fire raged alongside the barrier Xavier had created, eventually moving past the ranch buildings and continuing eastward. "That was too close," Xavier gasped, his face streaked with soot, one hand still gripping Cassandra's as if afraid to let go. "Are you hurt?" she asked, suddenly aware of their proximity, his arms still around her shoulders, her hand on his chest where she could feel his heart pounding. "Just twisted my ankle," he said, wincing as he tried to move it. "Nothing broken." Cassandra helped him to his feet, supporting him as they made their way slowly back to the ranch. The hands had managed to protect the buildings, though the scorched earth around them would take seasons to recover. That evening, after the chaos had subsided and the danger had passed, Cassandra sat with Xavier on the porch of the main house, his injured ankle propped up on a stool she had provided. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, but a blessed rain had finally begun to fall, extinguishing the last of the flames in the distance. "You saved my life today," Xavier said quietly, watching the raindrops create patterns in the dust. "You've saved mine 100 times over this past year," she replied, handing him a cup of coffee laced with a medicinal whiskey for the pain. "In different ways." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, lingering longer than necessary. Cassandra felt a now familiar flutter in her chest at the contact. "When I saw that fire heading toward you," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the gentle patter of rain, "I realized something." Xavier's eyes found hers in the dim light of the porch lantern, questioning. "I realized I couldn't bear the thought of losing you too," she said, the words coming out in a rush of emotion she had been holding back for months. Xavier set his cup aside, his expression unreadable. "Cassandra, I know it hasn't been that long since James," she continued, unable to stop now that she had begun. "And I know our arrangement was meant to be purely practical. But somewhere along the way, You became more than a business partner to me. Xavier reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. I've been fighting how I feel since that day at the cemetery, he confessed. Telling myself it wasn't right to care for a woman still grieving her husband. That you deserved better than a drifter who finally decided to stop wandering. Is that all you think you are? Cassandra asked, turning her hand to interlace her fingers with his. Because I see a man of honor and courage. Someone who stood by a stranger in her darkest hour, asking nothing in return. Someone who brought music and laughter back into a life I thought would never know those things again. The rain fell harder now, creating a curtain of silver around the porch, isolating them in a world of their own. Xavier lifted his free hand to touch her cheek, his touch so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. I love you, Cassandra Turner, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Have for months now. But I never wanted you to feel rushed or obligated. I love you too, she whispered, the words both frightening and freeing. And I think James would understand. He wouldn't want me to be alone. Xavier leaned forward, hesitating just before his lips met hers, giving her a chance to pull away. Instead, Cassandra closed the distance between them, her heart pounding as she kissed him tentatively at first, then with increasing certainty. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. I don't want to replace what you had with James, he said earnestly. I just want to build something new with you, if you'll have me. I think I'd like that very much, she replied, a smile blooming on her face that felt both unfamiliar and completely right. The days following the fire brought a shift in their relationship, subtle but significant. Xavier moved more of his belongings into the main house while he recovered from his injury, sleeping on a pallet near the hearth. Their evenings lengthened, conversations deepening as they shared parts of themselves they had kept hidden before. Cassandra told him of her fears during James's illness, the crushing responsibility of watching someone she loved slip away despite everything she tried to do to save him. Xavier spoke of the rootlessness that had defined his life, the restlessness that had driven him from place to place, and the unexpected peace he had found on the Turner ranch. One evening in early October, as the aspens turned golden on the hillsides, Xavier took Cassandra's hand as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. I've been thinking, he began, uncharacteristically hesitant, about us, about the future. Cassandra turned to face him, noting the unusual nervousness in his demeanor. What about it?
People talk, he said.
About us living and working together. Nothing scandalous yet, but it's a small town, and eventually. I see, Cassandra said, understanding his concern. Despite their propriety, their arrangement would eventually raise eyebrows in the conservative frontier community. I want to do right by you, Xavier continued. In every way. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing something small that caught the last rays of sunlight. This was my mother's. Not fancy, but solid gold. Like she was. In his palm lay a simple gold band, worn but well cared for. Cassandra's breath caught in her throat. Are you asking me to marry you? She whispered. Xavier nodded, his expression solemn. I am. But I understand if it's too soon, or if you want to wait until Cassandra pressed her fingers gently to his lips, stopping his words. It's not too soon, she assured him. Not when you've already shown me the kind of man you are day after day. She looked down at her left hand, where James's wedding band still rested. With careful deliberation, she slipped it off, holding it for a moment before placing it in her pocket. I'll always keep this, she said. Always remember him. But I'm ready for a new chapter now. With you. Xavier slid his mother's ring onto her finger, its size surprisingly close to perfect. We'll make it official whenever you're ready.
Norus.
Cassandra leaned forward to kiss him, her heart full. Before winter, she decided. I'd like to start the new year as your wife. They were married in the small church in San Pedro on the first Sunday in December 1878, snow dusting the ground outside like sugar on a wedding cake. Cassandra wore a new dress of deep blue velvet, her dark hair adorned with a small circle of white winter berries. Xavier, almost unrecognizable in his new suit, stood tall beside her, his voice steady as he spoke his vows. Mrs. Porter, who had become a dear friend, dabbed at her eyes throughout the ceremony. "Nothing more beautiful than love finding its way through sorrow," she whispered to her husband. "Like flowers pushing up through snow." The town turned out to celebrate with them, the social hall filled with music, food, and well wishes. Even Miss Simmons came to offer her congratulations, any previous interest in Xavier apparently replaced by her evident happiness with her own new fiancé, the blacksmith's son. To the Kellers, Mr. Wilson proposed a toast, raising his glass. "May your cattle be fat, your winters warm, and your home blessed with joy." The Kellers, Cassandra repeated later that night, testing the sound of it as Xavier carried her across the threshold of the ranch house, now truly their home. "I think I like the sound of that." "So do I, Mrs. Keller," Xavier replied, setting her gently on her feet, but keeping his arms around her. "So do I." Winter passed in a blur of contentment for the newlyweds. The ranch operated at a slower pace during the cold months, allowing them time to truly become acquainted as husband and wife. Xavier proved to be a considerate, passionate partner, and Cassandra discovered a happiness with him that was different from what she had known with James, not better or worse, just different, a new kind of love built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. By spring, new life was everywhere: calves in the pastures, shoots in the garden, and, most miraculously, the beginning of a child within Cassandra herself. "Are you certain?" Xavier asked when she told him, hope and concern mingling in his expression. "As certain as I can be," she replied, placing his hand over her still, flat stomach. "Mrs. Porter confirmed my suspicions yesterday." Xavier dropped to his knees before her, pressing his forehead against her middle. "A baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, running her fingers through his hair. He looked up at her, eyes shining. "Happier than I ever thought possible. But are you? Is it safe for you?" She understood his concern. Childbirth on the frontier was dangerous, medical help often too distant when complications arose. "Mrs. Porter has delivered more babies than I can count," Cassandra assured him. "And Dr. Miller has promised to be available when the time comes. We'll take every precaution." Xavier stood, enfolding her in a careful embrace, as if she had suddenly become fragile. "I'll build a proper crib," he decided, "and add that extra room we've been talking about. And hire more help so you don't have to work so hard." Cassandra laughed at his immediate planning. "We have months yet before the baby arrives. But yes to all of those things." As her body changed with the advancing pregnancy, Xavier became increasingly protective, insisting on handling the more strenuous ranch tasks himself despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of continuing most of her usual work. They compromised she would focus on the accounts, the garden, and the household while he managed the cattle and hired hands. One warm evening in late August 1879, as Cassandra sat on the porch sewing tiny garments for the approaching arrival, Xavier joined her with a letter in hand. "Mail came today," he said, settling beside her. "This one's from your sister in Pennsylvania." Cassandra set aside her sewing to open the letter, smiling as she read. "Elizabeth is expecting her third child," she reported. "She says she wishes she could be here for our baby's birth, but hopes we'll consider bringing the little one east for a visit someday." "Would you like that?" Xavier asked. "To go back east to see your family?" Cassandra considered the question. "Someday, perhaps. But this is our home." She took his hand, placing it on her rounded belly, where their child moved vigorously. "This is where we belong." The baby, a healthy, robust boy they named Thomas James Keller arrived on a crisp September morning after a labor that left both parents exhausted but overjoyed. Xavier, who had paced outside until Mrs. Porter finally invited him in to meet his son, held the tiny bundle with awe, his calloused hands gentle against the swaddling cloth. "He has your eyes," Cassandra said tiredly from the bed, watching her husband's face as he examined every perfect finger and toe. "And your strength," Xavier replied, carefully returning the infant to her arms. "Thank you for this gift, Cassandra. For our son. For everything." Life settled into new rhythms around the baby. Xavier expanded the ranch operations, hiring additional hands and purchasing neighboring land when it became available. Cassandra balanced motherhood with managing the household accounts, watching with pride as their modest operation grew into one of the most prosperous in the territory. Thomas grew into a curious, energetic toddler with his father's sandy hair and his mother's green eyes. By his second birthday, he was riding in front of Xavier on his horse and helping Cassandra in the garden, his small hands covered in dirt as he attempted to mimic her planting. In the spring of 1882, as Thomas approached his third birthday, Cassandra discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy proved more difficult than the first, with bouts of exhaustion that concerned Xavier enough to insist on bringing Dr. Miller from town to examine her. "Everything appears normal," the doctor reassured them after his examination. "But I recommend rest, Mrs. Keller. Your body is working hard to create this new life." Xavier took the doctor's words to heart, restructuring ranch operations to ensure Cassandra could rest as much as possible. He spent more time with Thomas, teaching the boy simple ranch tasks appropriate for his age and reading to him from the growing collection of books they had acquired. On a warm July evening, as Cassandra rested on the porch swing Xavier had built for her, he brought her a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, curious. "Open it," he urged, settling beside her with Thomas on his knee. Cassandra unwrapped the paper to find a small, leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the soft leather. "Thought you might want to write down memories for the children," Xavier explained. "Stories about their grandparents they'll never meet, about how we came to be a family. Your thoughts as you watch them grow." Tears welled in Cassandra's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's perfect. Thank you." That night, after Thomas was asleep, she began to write. "To my dear children, before you were born, before your father and I found each other, there was another chapter in my life. His name was James Turner, and though he is gone now, without him I would never have come to Montana, never have built this ranch that is your legacy, never have met your father in my moment of deepest grief." She wrote of the day James was buried at sunset, of the cowboy who told her she didn't have to stay and watch him go, but stood with her anyway. She wrote of the slow awakening of her heart, the gradual realization that life could contain joy again. She wrote of Xavier's steadfast presence, his quiet strength, his unexpected tenderness. When their daughter Catherine Elizabeth Keller arrived in November 1882, she was small but fierce, with a lusty cry that made Dr. Miller laugh as he placed her in Cassandra's arms. "She knows what she wants," the doctor observed, "just like her mother." Xavier, who had remained by Cassandra's side throughout the difficult delivery, looked exhausted but radiant as he gazed at his daughter. "She's perfect," he whispered, touching the dark wisp of hair on her tiny head. "Just perfect." As the years passed, the Keller family and their ranch flourished. They added a third child, William Xavier, in 1885, completing their family. The ranch expanded to become one of the most respected operations in Montana Territory, employing numerous hands and contributing significantly to the growing economy of San Pedro. Cassandra continued to write in her journal, documenting the milestones of their children's lives and reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. On quiet evenings, she would sometimes visit James's grave, now surrounded by a white picket fence Xavier had built and planted with wildflowers that bloomed from spring through fall. "I wish you could see them," she would tell James, speaking of the children who bore his name in their middle names, of the ranch that had grown from the modest homestead he had established. "I think you would be pleased with how things turned out." Xavier never questioned these visits, understanding they were part of honoring the past while embracing their present happiness. On their 10th wedding anniversary in December 1888, Xavier surprised Cassandra with a trip to San Francisco, their first real vacation since their marriage. Mrs. Porter, now a beloved grandmother figure to their children, stayed at the ranch while they traveled by train to the coast. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," Cassandra said as they settled into their private compartment on the train, watching the Montana landscape roll by. 10 whole days without children or cattle or ranch accounts. Xavier took her hand, bringing it to his lips. At 43, silver now threaded through his sandy hair, lines of experience etched around his eyes, but his gaze when it rested on her remained unchanged, warm, steady, loving. 10 years ago, you made me the happiest man in the territory, he said. Seems worth celebrating properly. Has it really been 10 years? She marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you stood with me at James's grave. Other times it feels like you've always been part of my life. Best decision I ever made, Xavier said, staying in San Pedro when every instinct told me to keep moving. Something held me there. Or someone, though I didn't know it yet. In San Francisco, they stayed in a fine hotel, attended the theater, dined in elegant restaurants, and walked along the harbor watching ships from around the world unload their exotic cargoes. They purchased gifts for the children, a telescope for Thomas, now 9 and fascinated by stars, an illustrated book of world mythology for Catherine, whose imagination outpaced even her prodigious vocabulary, and a miniature train set for 6-year-old William, who was obsessed with the iron horses that connected the expanding nation. On their last night in the city, they stood on a hillside overlooking the bay, the lights of the city twinkling below them like earthbound stars. "Thank you," Cassandra said, leaning against Xavier's solid warmth. "Not just for this trip, but for everything. For standing with me that day. For helping me keep the ranch. For loving me when I wasn't sure I could love again. For our beautiful children." Xavier wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on her head. "Thank you for letting me stay," he replied simply. "For giving me roots, a purpose, a family." "We've built something good, haven't we?" she asked, thinking of their thriving ranch, their healthy children, the community they had helped strengthen over the years. "Better than good," Xavier affirmed. "Something that will last beyond us." When they returned home, the children greeted them with exuberant embraces and a barrage of questions about the big city. Mrs. Porter had kept everything running smoothly in their absence, though she admitted with a laugh that young William had nearly convinced her that his bedtime was whenever the owls start hooting. Life continued its steady rhythm. Thomas grew into a serious young man with his father's practicality and his mother's head for business. Catherine developed into a spirited, independent girl who challenged conventions at every turn. William, the baby of the family, combined his brother's steadiness with his sister's imagination in a way that endeared him to everyone he met. As the century drew to a close, Montana achieved statehood, and San Pedro grew from a frontier town into a proper small city. The Keller Ranch, now known throughout the region for its quality stock and progressive ranching methods, stood as a testament to what determination, hard work, and partnership could achieve. On a warm afternoon in September 1899, as they celebrated Thomas's 20th birthday with a gathering that included nearly everyone from town, Cassandra found a quiet moment to slip away to the family cemetery, where James rested alongside Xavier's mother and father, who had passed away years before she met him but whose remains Xavier had brought to the ranch to rest alongside his new family. 20 years, she said softly to James's marker, now weathered but still standing straight. Our ranch is celebrating 2 decades. Thomas is a man now, heading to university in Denver next month. Catherine talks of becoming a doctor, if you can imagine. And William wants to be a writer. She knelt to arrange fresh flowers at the base of the marker, continuing her one-sided conversation as she had done periodically throughout the years. Xavier's hair is mostly silver now. Mine too, though I pretend not to notice. He still looks at me the same way he did when we were younger. Still stands beside me through everything. A familiar footfall behind her announced Xavier's presence before his hand came to rest gently on her shoulder. "Everything all right?" he asked. "The cake's about to be cut." Cassandra smiled up at him, taking his offered hand to rise. "Just updating James on family matters," she explained. "It's been 20 years, can you believe it?" Xavier's gaze moved from her face to the simple marker, then back. "Time passes, but some things remain constant," he said. "Like how grateful I am that you let me into your life." Cassandra reached up to touch his cheek, noting the lines that years of sun and wind and laughter had etched there. "That cowboy who stood with me at sunset," she said softly. "He changed everything." "That widow who is too stubborn to leave," Xavier countered with a smile. "She gave a drifter somewhere to belong." Hand in hand, they walked back to the celebration to their children, their friends, their home, the life they had built together from the ashes of grief and the seeds of compassion. Behind them, the Montana sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky with the same colors that had illuminated their beginning 22 years before. As they rejoined the party, Thomas called for attention, raising his glass. "To my parents," he said, his voice strong and clear, "who taught us that love can grow even in the hardest ground, that endings can become beginnings, and that home isn't just a place, it's the people who stand beside you through everything." Cassandra squeezed Xavier's hand as their family and friends echoed the toast. In his eyes, she saw reflected the same certainty she felt in her heart, that though their story had begun in sorrow at a sunset burial, it had blossomed into something beautiful, enduring, and ultimately triumphant. "To beginnings," Xavier whispered for her ears alone as he raised his glass to meet hers. "And to standing together," Cassandra replied, "no matter what comes."